You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host from New York City, Ankit Panda.
And this is Prashant Parmaswaran, your co-host from Washington, D.C.
Good to be back with you, Prashant. How are you doing?
Good, how are you doing?
Doing well. And we will be taking our listeners, I guess, to a remote part of Asia's geography that we haven't really gotten to before on this podcast. But this issue has been on the radar for certainly the last 5 years in a big way, but is really the result of several decades of policy. And specifically, what I'm talking about is the current crisis that is very much in the news involving the Rohingya in Myanmar's Rakhine state, which borders Bangladesh. So before we get into a discussion of the current crisis, which is a humanitarian crisis on really a new level than what we'd seen recently, even going back to the violence that broke out 5 years ago, it really appears that the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar has reached a new level, judging by the violence we've seen in late August and running into early September. But first, I'll just offer a little bit of background, since not all of our listeners might be familiar with the Rohingya. Certainly, it's a crisis that hasn't received the kind of headline attention that a lot of other humanitarian issues are. So I guess we can start with maybe the word Rohingya, what it means. It is thought to come from the word Rohan, which is thought by some people to have come from Arakan, which was the former kingdom in the area currently known as Rakhine State in Myanmar. So Myanmar is a large Southeast Asian country with 53 million people. Rakhine State has 3.1 million people. 1 million of the people in Rakhine State, or roughly a third, are part of the Rohingya ethnic group. And what these people are is that they have essentially been in the area for a while, but today they are essentially a people without a home. They are not treated as Myanmar citizens in the fullest sense. They are treated as second-class citizens in Myanmar, and they are referred to formally by the Myanmar government as Bengalis. And there's a reason for that. It is because they are ethnically, religiously different from the predominantly Buddhist population in the remainder of Rakhine State, and indeed Myanmar at large. And they're thought to have closer ties to the Bengali people of South Asia, who today obviously reside in India and Bangladesh, which also borders this part of Myanmar. The Bangladesh government, meanwhile, treats the Rohingya as a population that isn't Bengali. They treat them as refugees and migrants, and the treatment of this minority group by Bangladesh has also been deplorable to an extent, and the Bangladeshi government simply isn't able to deal with the current influx of tens of thousands of Rohingya refugees into its territory. But yeah, so the crisis that we're observing right now really, I guess, comes down to a new surge of violence involving Rohingya insurgents, who the Myanmar government describes as terrorists, who have conducted attacks on Myanmar's Burmese state authorities, including the police, which has led to a major military crackdown, which has included reports of several atrocities, the burning down of Rohingya villages in the region, prompting a massive refugee outflow that the United Nations now estimates could lead to an outflow of as many as 300,000 Rohingya, which is, as I said earlier, a million, so roughly a third of the total population. So this is really a crisis on a new level that we really haven't seen in Rakhine State before. So Prashant, I mean, that's a very broad strokes, background to this crisis. But I'm wondering, could you tell us a bit about how the Burmese government, which transitioned to democracy in 2015, as we discussed on this podcast before, is currently led by Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi, who is state counselor, the de facto leader of the country. Can you tell us a bit about how the Burmese government has historically regarded the Rohingya in Rakhine State, and how it's currently managing this crisis?
Yeah, so the government response is kind of an interesting one, because there was a period immediately following the country's independence where the country was a democracy, and then it followed sort of decades of military leadership. And then this historic election that was won by Aung San Suu Kyi and her opposition, National League for Democracy, NLD, was marking a return to civilian rule in the country in decades. But throughout this process, I would say, if you were to characterize the government response, it'd be a mix of neglect, abuse, and sometimes violence towards the Rohingya. I mean, this is a population which they had their citizenship stripped in 1974, and there have been various instances of violence where tens of thousands, at times hundreds of thousands, have been forced to leave the country due to widespread prosecution. So you had a round of violence in the 1970s, you had another big one in the 1990s, And as you correctly noted, I mean, the last round of notable violence was back in 2012. And the last time that this crisis kind of made the headlines was in 2015, right? When we
Mhm.
saw about 25,000 Rohingyas trying to flee across boats across the Andaman Sea, and that resulted in huge cry for international attention. So I think the issue with the Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD government is that the expectations have significantly increased in terms of what the Myanmar government is supposed to do. I think, most people, even those human rights organizations and individuals who care about the Rohingya and their fate, would acknowledge the fact that the government has extremely limited capabilities when they're dealing with the situation, and there's other complexities and complications like the fact that Aung San Suu Kyi doesn't fully control Myanmar, right? I mean, the military in Myanmar still has a dominant influence in terms of particular ministries, but also controlling security in the country. So her capabilities are extremely limited. That being said, I mean, it's kind of hard for even the casual observer to feel sorry for the government, given the fact that we haven't even seen the basic response that we'd expect from the Aung San Suu Kyi government come up. We don't have basic access in terms of humanitarian assistance. The media hasn't been able to get access to actually cover the situation. So we've got, the estimates that you cited. I mean, these have been going up sometimes by the day. This crisis erupted 2 weeks ago. We're not even sure how many of these individuals are actually fleeing.
Mhm.
So given that those basic standards of government response haven't been met, I'm not surprised that we've seen, sort of international condemnation across the board of the government.
Yeah, and I mean, this issue of Aung San Suu Kyi and the civilian government is interesting because a common strain of commentary on the Rohingya crisis really has, I mean, you see some commentators who, maybe knew who Aung San Suu Kyi was, knew the situation
Mm-hmm.
in Myanmar, observed the transition to democracy in 2015, and said, "Oh, great, this country transitioned to democracy. Things are going to be a lot better overall." And that also applies to this Rohingya crisis, which, as you noted, in 2015 did attract quite a bit of news based on the migration issue, which became a major issue in ASEAN, obviously. But I mean, as you noted, I mean, even though the government doesn't have total control over the activities of the Burmese military, what we've seen really isn't, there is clear evidence of complicity, right, in what is going on in Rakhine State. I mean, the government has, in a sense, acted as a cheerleader for the military in many ways. They have described international aid organizations working in the area as having assisted the insurgents, which has really put aid workers at risk in the area. They have alleged that Rohingya are burning down their own villages. And, granted, reports here are mixed. Maybe we can talk a bit about this group known as the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, or ARSA, which is the insurgent group now at the heart of this, that the Burmese government describes as terrorists. And look, I mean, Burma is a country with problems with several militant groups, but really I think the government has taken a very different approach to specifically the Rohingya insurgents who they've described as terrorists, which they have not done with the wide range of other militant groups who they've entered a peace process with in many other cases. So there is this kind of sense that the civilian government in Myanmar, even though it doesn't exercise full control over the military, is in a big way complicit, and there's a lot more that they could have done to really stave this up. I mean, even though, I mean, there is the question of the legal status of the Rohingya, which remains, I mean, deplorable. I mean, everything from this minority being required to seek government permission for marriages, to really, I mean, lacking any of the trappings of citizenship in the country. So really, I mean, it's been not only disappointing, but I mean, really, I don't think it's going too far to suggest that there is a degree of complicity with this government. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue of complicity definitely has come up in this context, and it actually is it's very difficult definitively to say the extent to which the government is complicit because, you not only have the military and this group that calls itself the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, or ARSA, which really we don't really have a lot of information about it, and there's also vigilantes and other groups that sometimes camouflage themselves when they go out and carry out attacks. And given the fact that the Aung San Suu Kyi government hasn't allowed proper media coverage and hasn't allowed full access to humanitarian organizations, it's very difficult to determine the exact level of complicity. But I think you're right in suggesting that the fact that we have the military going in and carrying out these, I mean, essentially mass killings of targeted at Muslim Rohingya civilians, right? There's documented evidence of burning, rape, torture, And as you pointed out, I mean, you have hundreds of thousands, which is a third or a quarter, depending on the estimate, of the entire Rohingya population in Rakhine State fleeing to Bangladesh. Right, they're trekking across the jungles for days just to get out of the situation. So, and the response you get out from the government, the dominant response is kind of a mix of denial and then also calling this group terrorists.
Right.
But essentially, the situation is pretty clear, right? Like over the decades, we've had a group that's been subjected to neglect, abuse, and violence, and for a long time, close observers of Southeast Asia have been warning the government that if you don't address this issue, this is eventually going to fuel what is going to become an insurgency. And the past year or two, we've seen sporadic attacks. Last year, the group that calls itself ARSA or elements of it carried out an attack on police posts that was quite similar.
Right, in October.
Right. And then we saw an outbreak of violence in response, similar, albeit at a smaller scale. So this is something that has been very clearly a long time in the making. And so I think it's clear that the government's lack of response in dealing with the situation has fueled it. What I would say about the current crisis is that, unfortunately, irrespective of what you think about the degree of complicity, it's unfortunate that the government has basically played into the hands of this terrorist group, or whatever you want to call them, insurgent group, terrorist group. Because essentially what happened was they conducted an attack on these police posts. The attack itself was a dismal failure, but the heavy-handed government response, which targeted civilians, has fueled support for this group and attention on this group as well, which is exactly, sort of terrorism or insurgency 101, right? Like, you try to engineer an attack against a government, you provoke a reprisal that's overwhelming in response, and then you get more support and you fuel your ranks. So by doing this, the government is really undermining itself in the process.
Right. Yeah. So let's talk a bit about ARSA. I mean, it's this fascinating group that a lot of analysts in the region, I mean, I guess Southeast Asia, South Asia, I think have really kind of perked up since there is this new now insurgent group in Rakhine State that defines itself as a self-defense organization intending to defend the Rohingya, who have been repeatedly persecuted for decades against the Burmese state. But there's also been these concerning reports. The International Crisis Group, at least, which has been one of the groups that I've really been relying on to kind of keep track of what is happening simply in Rakhine State, pointed out as early as last year, after the October attacks, that ARSA had been receiving support from individuals who were located outside of the region in Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, which adds a really interesting element to this whole crisis. It really comes back to this idea of the insurgency in Rakhine State with the Rohingya, who are a persecuted Muslim minority, starting to gain support across the Muslim world more broadly. I mean, in recent days, we've seen support out of Turkey. President Erdogan has been quite vocal on this issue in particular. The OIC has drawn attention to this. Muslim leaders within ASEAN, including Malaysia's Najib Razak, have spoken out on this quite forcefully as well. So it is turning into a quite serious issue, at least within the Muslim world, more at large. And yep. I mean, the question of what ARSA is and how it evolves from here, I think, really is poorly understood at this point, right? I mean, we don't know if this is an insurgent group, perhaps comparable to, several militant groups that operate, for example, in Kashmir against the Indian state, who might or might not necessarily have backing from the Pakistani government. Some of them do. In the case of ARSA, we've seen kind of thinly sourced reports that imply material support is coming for these groups from Pakistan, Saudi Arabia. Unknown about the extent again. But I think, these are really serious questions that merit consideration. I mean, it really points to the possibility of this turning into a real nightmare for both the Burmese government and obviously the Rohingya civilian population, who are ultimately caught in the crossfire here. And there's nowhere for them to go. I mean, Rakhine State is on the water. It's on the Bay of Bengal. Either they have to sail out by sea, trying to find a better place somewhere else, but no one is really interested in taking in the Rohingya, including India, including Bangladesh. Southeast Asian countries have stepped up in a limited way. But really, I mean, this is just... it's a pressure cooker with really, it's just, it had been waiting to blow for a while, and I guess we're witnessing the first steps here. But what's your what's your sense of the regional response here? I mean, I described it a bit. I mean, really, it's been dismal for the Rohingya. I mean, apart from aid groups, nonprofits, and the United Nations, they really have very few friends.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, and I think it's what you're seeing is this pattern where you've had hundreds of thousands of Rohingyas that have been persecuted in the country, fleeing to various countries, whether it's neighboring or sometimes as far as Middle East, and then you have this group now, ARSA, which depending on whether you want to believe what's actually coming out in terms of their propaganda and some of the websites, it's led by an individual. The name is Atullah Abu Ammar Jununi. He's born in Pakistan, raised in Saudi Arabia, and has allegedly come home to now lead this so-called insurgency, right? And he has said publicly the group's objective is primarily national, right? To liberate the Rohingya from oppression from the Myanmar government. And he's gone out of his way, unsurprisingly, to say that the group has no foreign backing. But as you correctly pointed out, I mean, no shortage of analysts have pointed out that there are these foreign links. And if you look at other insurgencies in the region, the southern Thailand, whether you look at the Philippines, Indonesia, I mean, the question is not really whether foreign links exist. There is no doubt that some kind of foreign links exist. The question is, does that alter the goals of the insurgency in terms of what they're seeking, what kinds of targets that they're having? So far, it's primarily national in orientation, but as you pointed out earlier, I mean, who knows, right? I mean, this is a situation that 3-4 years ago, if you were to say that there was going to be an insurgent group that was waging battle in Myanmar and was getting international headlines, you wouldn't have been believed. But this is the situation we're finding ourselves now. And with respect to the international response, I think the summary is right, which is that the Rohingya have very few friends. There is no shortage of international actors that are trying to make headlines based on what's happening. I mean, you have Malaysia and Indonesia contributing some assistance, but they also, primarily Malaysia's Prime Minister Najib Razak has been criticized even in Malaysia and as well as elsewhere of trying to capitalize on the Rohingya issue as a domestic political issue to win votes among the Malaysian population, but actually not matching the rhetoric with actual assistance and aid. As you pointed out, I mean, that's kind of the situation the Rohingya are in, where there are countries that are unwilling to take them in different numbers. Malaysia has done that somewhat. There are Rohingya in Malaysia, but the question is, how much of these individuals can you take in, right? Bangladesh, for example, is already a pretty poor country, already overstretched in terms of resources. So if you have hundreds of thousands of Rohingya pouring into Bangladesh, they need to be taken in by other countries, and other countries would only be willing to take in a limited number. So I think the scale really is an issue here when you're talking about the positions of various international actors. I mean, you'll see no shortage of rhetorical condemnation and allegations of genocide and so on and so forth. But the proof of the pudding will be to what degree are these countries actually willing to do something in terms of taking people in. And it's worth pointing out here. I mean, the Rohingya, they're a dramatic example of a stateless people, but you do see parallels with whether you're looking at the Palestinians, you have Muslim or Muslim majority countries condemning the Israelis, but actually not willing to take in a large number of Palestinians when it actually comes to the heart of the issue. And I think you're seeing a similar issue with the Rohingya.
Yeah, I think that's a really apt comparison. It's also just the question of geography for them, which I think is really an unfortunate part. I mean, in a lot of these refugee crises, people do ultimately try to flee first by foot, but if not by sea. And Thailand, one of Myanmar's neighbors, granted on the other side of the country from Rakhine state, has also been a fairly popular influx point. But that again, leads to human smuggling in the region, leads to kind of deadly encounters at sea. And the Thai government has actually been cracking down on smuggling rings who are transporting Rohingya among other groups around this region as well. So do you I mean, ASEAN? We talk about ASEAN all the time in sort of these when it comes to these hot button regional issues all the time. I mean, ASEAN has been frankly quite disappointing on this issue. Do you see any improvement lying ahead on this, or is this simply an issue that ASEAN is not equipped to handle as an organization?
Yeah, I mean, that's with respect to ASEAN, that's kind of always the issue when you talk about these hot button issues, whether it's the South China Sea or the Rohingya situation. ASEAN itself is as we've talked about before, a group of very diverse states. So you do have countries, Muslim majority states like Malaysia and Indonesia that have more of an interest in dealing with this issue because it, to a certain extent, is a domestic political issue as well. But then you have other countries that take less of an interest, either because they're lesser developed, so they're not in a position to give as much aid, or they don't really want to alienate the Burmese government because this is a very sensitive issue for them.
Hmm.
And that's not just an issue for ASEAN, but you also mentioned India, and Prime Minister Narendra Modi was just in Myanmar, and there was following his visit and even during his visit there were all kinds of conversation about why he wasn't taking a stronger stance on the Rohingya issue. But it, we both watch Indian foreign policy pretty closely, and I think it's fair to say this was nothing dramatic in terms of India's position in Myanmar, right?
Yeah.
I mean, India, has sort of always been trying to balance its interests and ideals, and it does have a significant interest in making sure it has a close relationship with the Burmese government, irrespective of what they're doing with the Rohingya. I mean, whether you're dealing with the Northeast India problem with militancy, or you're dealing with economic and strategic influence relative to China. So the point that you illustrated earlier, which is, I mean, at the end of the day, the Rohingya have very few friends, is apt, even when you're talking about its immediate neighbors, unfortunately.
Absolutely. Which I guess, brings me to another question that I think is worth discussing. I mean, Myanmar's transition to democracy in 2015 was in a large part, midwifed by the United States. And I pegged along as one of the Obama administration's kind of hallmark foreign policy accomplishments, even though it's not really talked about that often. But now, we've talked about this before. We have a Trump administration that's not particularly interested in kind of quote unquote soft issues like human rights. Ethnic cleansing in Rakhine state would be something that would probably be quite difficult to get this U.S. president to take an interest in. But where does U.S. policy really stand at this point? I mean, there is kind of, there is still a stock taking going on of the health of Myanmar's democracy more broadly after a relative period of optimism in late 2015 and early 2016. But where are things today?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very much the elephant in the room when you come to international engagements that Myanmar has, because essentially you did have this period with the United States and to a lesser extent the European Union and other Western countries tried to sort of engineer this process where there would be a free election and Aung San Suu Kyi and her government would come to power, and that would essentially facilitate the easing of sanctions that occurred before, and you'd have hopefully a situation in Myanmar that was less dire than before. Unfortunately, what that's done is it's firstly raised the level of expectation in terms of what people are hoping to accomplish from the Myanmar government's perspective and Aung San Suu Kyi. But at the same time, Western countries, including the United States, have lost a significant amount of leverage because they've lifted the sanctions already. And they did it under the assumption that the Aung San Suu Kyi government would eventually get to a position where they're dealing with these human rights and democracy issues much better than they were before. Unfortunately, that just simply hasn't been the case, not only with respect to the Rohingya, whether you look at freedom of expression, the media, even close supporters of the Aung San Suu Kyi government and Myanmar within the U.S. government will say privately that they're extremely disappointed at what the Aung San Suu Kyi government has done thus far. So that creates an issue for the U.S. government, because I think there were people who are pretty bullish on U.S.-Myanmar relations and were saying, oh, now that we have sanctions eased and we have Aung San Suu Kyi in power, maybe we can think about military engagement with the military in Myanmar and with the United States, and Myanmar can emerge as a security partner for Washington. Well, I think it's very hard to have those conversations now, and U.S.-Myanmar engagement when you have these human rights and democracy conversations that are very uncomfortable, and to be honest, I mean it has been really, really disheartening, the level of regression that we've seen the last 2-3 years.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess if Prayut and Duterte will soon be in the White House, maybe anything's possible at this point. I guess to close out the podcast, I mean, we are on the cusp of the UN General Assembly about to open and the general debate, and actually part of me wonders if we'll actually see the leaders of several OIC states, Muslim states, really make this issue an important part of their speeches this year. And I wonder what that kind of international response might have on the Burmese government's decision making. I mean, clearly to this point, any kind of international pressure, be it from governments or non-governmental organizations, has failed to really move the needle. There is this commission that the Burmese government set up, led by former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, that had actually just released some recommendations right before the latest bout of violence, including allowing the Rohingya to enjoy some of the benefits of citizenship, removing the restrictions on their movement, and simply decreasing the amount of persecution. But I think this is just a really interesting time for this crisis to really end up in the headlines right before the General Assembly, especially with like Erdogan and Turkey making all this noise. It seems like we could see quite a bit of attention to it this year.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's definitely a space to watch. So you're right to raise it. In fact, I mean, there have been a number of countries who have already said that they're going to raise it at the UN General Assembly and then also at OIC fora as well. So that's definitely something that we ought to watch internationally.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we should definitely keep an eye on this and come back to it. I mean, I guess it also speaks to the degree to which this crisis is regarded on, kind of the global radar of crises, that it's taken us this long on this podcast to get to it. It's certainly acquiring increased geopolitical importance in the Asia Pacific, especially in Southeast Asia, but also drawing South Asian states in, as we know. So yeah, we'll keep an eye on this, and we'll come back to it as it grows and evolves. Well, thanks for joining me today, Prashant.
Sounds good.
All right. Well, for our listeners, if you haven't subscribed to the podcast, please do so you don't miss future episodes. And if you have been a subscriber, but you haven't left us a rating yet on iTunes or Google Play, please do so. We'd really appreciate that. It gets the word out about the show. And if there's a topic you'd like us to address on the podcast that you haven't heard yet and you'd like to hear us discuss, please let me know. We'll be back soon with more. Thanks for listening.